My wife took care of me for 6 years, and she is also the reason I couldn't stand up. I was in a wheelchair for 3 years. I couldn't hold a cup on my own. I couldn't get to my feet. There were days I wasn't clear enough in the head to finish a sentence. Then one morning, the housekeeper looked at the tea my wife had just brought up, and she asked me a question. "Mr. Sedlak, have you ever noticed that you're always sharp on Saturdays?" I went completely still, because Saturday was the one day of the week my wife wasn't home to make my tea. Petra started pouring my wife's tea down the sink and making me a fresh cup herself. 5 weeks later, I could hold the cup on my own. 10 weeks later, I stood up. And that was when the worst thought of my life finally landed. The person I trusted more than anyone in that house might be the reason I was wasting away. I still live with her. I still watch her take care of me every day. And the part that frightens me most? I still love her. My name is August Sedlak. Everybody calls me Gus. I'm 58 years old, and 2 years ago I could not lift a cup of tea, and this morning I walked 4 miles along the lakefront before breakfast. I want to be honest about something before I start. I have told parts of this in a courtroom, and parts of it to my son, and parts of it to nobody at all. This is the first time I've put the whole thing in one line, end to end, and I already know there are 2 or 3 places where I'm going to come off worse than you expect. I'm leaving those in. Let's start in a kitchen in Shaker Heights on a Wednesday in March. Petra Ose has cooked in my house since 2005. She came to Cleveland from Accra when she was 26 and she's 62 now. She raised 3 children on what my family paid her. She put 2 of them through school, and she has a way of coming into a room that does not disturb the room. She has been in that kitchen every weekday morning for 20 years. She knows what I looked like at 42, and at 48, and at 56. That morning she was wiping down the counter behind my chair, and she stopped, and she stood there with the cloth still in her hand. She said, "Mr. Sedlak, how long have you had the fog in the mornings?" I said, "Years." She said, "No, not years. In the mornings." I looked up at her, and she said, "You are clear on Saturdays." I want you to sit in that sentence with me for a second, because I have been sitting in it for 2 years. My wife Delia left the house at 5:30 every Saturday morning to coach her niece's hockey team out in Strongsville. 6:15 practice. She was gone before the kettle went on. And on Saturdays, Petra made the tea. Petra had noticed that. Over some number of months, she has never told me how many, and I have never pushed her on it, she noticed, and she did not say one word about it to a single human being on this earth. I was 56 years old. I had been in a wheelchair for 3 years. I could not raise my arms above shoulder height by the end of an afternoon. I had not cut my own food in 11 months. And there were days I could not follow a conversation all the way to the end of it. I said, "Petra?" And she said, "I know. That's the whole exchange." 2 words each. It took about 9 seconds, and I have thought about it every single day since. Neither of us said the word poison, not that morning, and not for 4 months afterward. 2 people standing in a kitchen agreed on the worst thing either of them had ever considered, without one of us saying it out loud. Because saying it out loud makes it a thing you have to act on. And neither of us was ready. Let me tell you who I was before, because you can't understand what. My grandfather was Aloysius Sedlak. He came out of Broadway Slavic Village, and started a glass company in 1951 with a borrowed truck, 1 annealing oven, and a contract to reglaze a high school on the east side. Sedlak Architectural Glass. Curtain wall, spandrel panels, structural glazing, blast-resistant units for federal work. If you've driven the shoreway in the last 30 years and looked at the skyline, some fraction of what you were looking at came off a line on the Cuyahoga with my family's name on the crate. My father, Emmett, took it in 1977 and tripled it. He put my grandmother's name on a chapel and a wing of a children's hospital. He sat on 4 boards. He was a hard man in a way I did not understand until I was about 40 myself, and by then he was dead and it was too late to ask him about any of it. We lived in Shaker Heights. I went to school where you go. My mother's name was Genevieve, and she wore gloves to church into the 1990s. I took the company at 36, when my father's heart quit in a parking lot at our own plant. I ran it for 19 years before I couldn't. 362 employees. 3 facilities. 174 million in revenue in the last year I was actually inside that building. My grandfather is on the wall in the lobby, in a photograph from 1958, standing in front of a rack of plate glass with his sleeves rolled up. There's a smaller one beside it of my father in 1984, in a suit, not smiling. And there's an empty space where mine should go. I have never let them hang it. I'd like to tell you that's humility. I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I don't think it is. I met Delia Vaughn in 1999, in the rain, in a parking lot behind a hospital benefit downtown. She was parking cars. She was 27. She had a 4-year-old daughter named Tova, a mother in a rented duplex in Parma, and a second shift starting at 11 that night. It had been raining for 6 hours. There were maybe 200 cars on that lot, and one woman running all of it. She was quick. That's what I remember about the first 10 minutes. Not beautiful, though she was. Quick. She said something to me about my car that was funny and slightly rude and completely accurate, and I stood out in that rain talking to her for 13 minutes while a line of people in evening clothes built up behind me. I was 32 years old, and I had never once in my life had to wait for anything, and I stood in the rain. My mother met her that spring and was perfectly pleasant to her face for 2 hours. That night she called me and said, "August, she has done the arithmetic on you." I said that was an ugly thing to say. And my mother said, "I'm not telling you she's a bad woman. I'm telling you she did the arithmetic, and I'd like it on the record that I know it, and you know it, and that from tonight forward you are choosing it." Everybody had a version of that sentence. My uncle. 2 of my father's directors. A man I'd gone to school with who took me to lunch specifically to say it, and never got another lunch out of me as long as he lived. And here's what I thought at 32, and I want to say plainly that I was not wrong to think it. I thought, of course they say that. That is what people in my family say about anybody who did not grow up the way we grew up. My grandfather's own people said it about my grandmother, who came out of a coal town in Pennsylvania with a cardboard suitcase. It's the oldest sentence in a family like mine, and it usually tells you a great deal more about the person saying it than the person it's said about. So I married her in 2003. 380 people. My mother wore gray and was gracious to every single guest all evening. Now, there's a version of this story that's a lie, and I want to kill it right here, before it gets comfortable. Delia was good. Not tolerable, not calculating and covering it well. Good. She learned that business. She sat in on quarterly reviews for 2 full years without saying a word, and then she started saying things, and the things were sharp. She got on with the men on the fabrication floor in a way I never entirely managed, because every one of them had known my father and had known me since I was 9 years old. She sat with my mother for the last 7 weeks of her life. She was there the afternoon it happened. I was in Columbus and I did not make it back. And my mother said something to her at the end that Delia never once repeated to me, and that I never asked her for. There's a photograph on the back stairs of that house of the 2 of us, at a topping out in 2009. She's laughing at something with one shoe in her hand, because the heel had gone straight through the deck grating. It's still up there. My son asked me about it once, and I told him I'd get to it. That was 2 years ago. 12 years. She was a good wife for 12 years. And anybody who tells you a person can't be both has never watched it happen slowly. My father made us sign a prenuptial agreement. He did it in a way that was not cruel and was not negotiable. Spring of 2003, in his study, with his attorney already sitting in the room before either of us walked in. He said the family had held that company for 2 generations. He said there was going to be a document, and he said he was telling us in front of each other so that nobody could ever claim it happened behind a closed door. Delia signed it. She read all of it first. The attorney noted that in his file, and she took her own counsel, which my father insisted on and paid for. In the car afterward, she was quiet for about 10 minutes. Then she said, "Your father doesn't think much of me." I said he didn't think much of anybody. And she said, "That's not the same thing, Gus, and you know it." That is the only time in 22 years she ever raised it. Once. In a car. And I let it go, because letting things go was what I was good at. The agreement capped what she'd take if the marriage ended. A fixed number, indexed. Generous by most standards in this country, not by ours. And separate from that, there was my father's trust. The instrument that actually holds the company, and it was written the way those things get written in families like mine. A surviving spouse receives income for life. The principal goes to blood. Which meant that if I died, Delia got a monthly number until the day she died, and could leave nothing behind her, nothing to pass on, nothing with her name on it. And Toby, who was not mine by blood, and who I never once in 22 years called my stepdaughter out loud, got nothing at all. Delia read those documents in the autumn of 2010. I know the date because our attorney logged the request. She never said one word to me about it, not that autumn, not for the next 15 years. Toby was 6 when she started calling me Gus, not Dad. Nobody pushed her toward Dad and I wouldn't have wanted it. She had a father somewhere in Michigan who sent things at Christmas for about 5 years and then stopped. Gus is what her mother called me, so that's what she landed on, and she said it something like 400,000 times over 22 years. I have not heard it since a Tuesday morning in October. I amended my personal will in 2012. I did it quietly. I didn't announce it and I didn't discuss it because it did not seem to me like the kind of thing a man announces. 4 ways equal Delia, Toby, my son, Cass, and a scholarship fund in my mother's name. Toby was 17 years old and had been living in my house since she was 4, and I put her in for a full quarter share of everything I personally owned outside that trust, which was not a small pile of anything. My attorney asked me at the time whether I wanted to tell Delia. I said no. He asked me why, and I gave him an answer I believed, which was that a thing like that changes how people behave, and I didn't want anything changing. That answer was true. It was not the whole truth. Here's the whole truth, and it took me 2 years in a courtroom to be able to say it out loud. I liked knowing it. I liked being a man who had quietly done a decent thing, and I liked it more because nobody knew. There's a kind of vanity in that, a very quiet, very expensive kind, and it cost me more than any other single decision I have made in my life. Nobody knew. My attorney knew. That's the entire list. My son is Cass. He was born in 2001, 2 years before the wedding, and his mother is a woman named Ren Aguirre, who I loved and did not marry, and that's a failure of mine and not a story about anybody else. Ren and I raised that boy across 2 houses without ever putting a lawyer between us. He was at my place every other weekend and half of every summer from the time he was 2 years old. Delia was good with him. That's another thing I'm not going to take away from her. The 2 kids were 6 years apart. They were not siblings and they were not enemies, and there were summers where they shared a bathroom for 8 weeks and got along fine. I was diagnosed 11 years ago, at 47. It started with my eyelid, then double vision late in the day, then a weakness in my arms that got worse the longer I used them and better when I rested, which is the signature of the thing, and which still took a neurologist named Aurelio Benag 4 months and 2 rounds of testing to pin down. Myasthenia gravis. Your immune system attacks the connection between nerve and muscle. It's serious. It's treatable. Managed properly, most people do very well for a very long time. I did very well for 4 years. I was on a maintenance regimen, a set of medications taken every day, without which the disease comes back and takes ground it does not give back. Delia handled it. And that was not a scheme, and it was not suspicious, and every married person listening to this knows exactly how it happened. There was a stretch where my hands were bad, and I genuinely could not work the bottle caps. So she filled the prescriptions, and she sorted the week into the plastic organizer on Saturday nights, and she handed them to me in the morning with the tea. Then my hands got better, and she kept doing it. Because by then it was just a thing she did. 7 years ago, it started coming back. Slowly. That's the part that makes it invisible. There was no morning I woke up worse. There were months where I was about the same, then a month where I wasn't, then a stretch of 8 or 9 weeks holding steady that made me think it had stopped. Dr. Banag adjusted things. Then he adjusted them again. Then a third time. There's a phrase in my chart, and it appears 14 separate times across 5 years. Poorly responsive to therapy? 14 times. I have that chart. It's 400 and some pages, and I have read every page of it twice. That phrase is not an accusation of anything. It's a careful physician writing down honestly that the treatment which works for most people is not working for this patient. 5 years of a good doctor writing that sentence and being wrong every single time, and not one person on this earth could fault him for it. He has not entirely forgiven himself. I'll come back to that. I stopped driving 6 years ago. I used a cane for about 10 months, then a rollator, and I hated that rollator so much that I skipped my nephew's wedding rather than be seen with it. 5 years ago, I stopped being able to manage my own front steps. There were contractors in that driveway for 5 weeks building a ramp to the side entrance, and I sat in the front room and listened to them build it. There are 4 moments in those 5 years I keep going back to. The first was a Thursday in the 2nd year, out on the fabrication floor, when I caught the toe of my shoe on a floor track and went down on both knees in front of 9 men. A line supervisor named Royce Dembeck got me up. He did it fast, and he did it in a way that made it look like he'd been reaching past me for something else, and he never mentioned it to a living soul, and he retired the following spring without ever bringing it up. I have never thanked him. I've picked up the phone twice. The second was standing in front of a mirror in my own bedroom for 9 minutes trying to get a cufflink through a buttonhole. The third was the first time somebody at that company slowed down for me. And if you've ever been sick, you know exactly what I mean. A director was walking me to a meeting, and around the second corner he shortened his stride, and neither of us said anything about it. After that, everybody did it. The fourth was my granddaughter's baptism. I didn't go. I told everybody it was the drive. The chair came that spring. I was 55. I had run a company with 362 people in it. I rode in college. And I could not get up out of a chair without 2 people. And in every single one of those months, I need you to hold on to this, because everything that comes later depends on it. My wife was there. She drove me to appointments. She sat in the parking garage at the clinic, reading on her phone for 2 hours at a stretch. She learned the transfer, which is a physical skill and not an easy one, and she did it 4 and 5 times a day for 3 years, and she hurt her own back doing it, and she never once complained where I could hear her. She was kind to me constantly. That's the thing people cannot make fit, and I have stopped trying to make it fit for them. She was kind, and she brought me tea at 20 to 7 every morning, and she was doing what she was doing the entire time. 4 years ago, I signed a durable power of attorney. It was the correct thing to do, and any lawyer in this country would have told me the same. I was declining. There was a company, and there had to be somebody who could act if I couldn't. Delia became my attorney, in fact. She could vote my shares. She could sign for me. She could do essentially anything I could do. She was by then effectively running that company anyway. She'd been going into the building 4 days a week for 2 years. She sat in my chair at the head of that table, and she was good at it, and the board went along because the alternative was a sick man on a speakerphone. The last board meeting I attended in person was 3.5 years ago. I couldn't follow the second half of it, and I did not want anybody watching me try. After that, I stopped going. Then the packets stopped coming, and I noticed, and I said nothing because asking for the packets would have meant admitting that I wanted to read them and couldn't. Then I stopped asking about the business at all, and Delia started telling me about it over dinner, the way you tell somebody a story. And that was easier for both of us. And after about a year, I could not have told you the margin on a single product line in a company my grandfather started with a borrowed truck. Cass started coming around less about 4 years ago. He'd tell you now that it wasn't a decision. He was 22. He had a job and a girlfriend and a father who was harder to be around every single time. There were weekends he meant to come and didn't, the way everybody does. But there was also a stretch where he called the house and got Delia, and was told I was having a bad day. Then it was several bad days. Then it was, honestly, Bud, he gets agitated when there's a lot of people, and it takes him 2 days to come back down. Then Delia started calling him instead. Once a week, warmly, to tell him how his father was doing. And my son, who was 23 years old and did not want to be a burden on a household under strain, stopped calling the house and waited for the update. If you're angry at that kid right now, I need you to hear me. That's exactly how it works. Nobody in this story is stupid. The trap isn't built out of lies you could catch. It's built out of reasonable explanations, handed one at a time to people who never sit in the same room and compare them. 3 years ago, Cass drove out to the plant to drop off a birthday thing for me, because he knew I'd be there for a physical therapy appointment in the medical suite. His badge didn't work. He had been on that access list since he was 15 years old. The man at the security desk had known him since he was in a car seat. He looked at the screen for a long while, and then he told my son he was sorry, and that he had a list. He wouldn't show it to him. He was almost certainly told not to. Cass called his mother from that parking lot and cried, and Ren told him that families get strange when somebody's dying, and that he should let it go. Ren called the house herself later that year. She got Delia. They had a perfectly pleasant 20-minute conversation, at the end of which Ren Aguirre came away believing that my condition made visitors difficult, and that the family was doing absolutely everything they could. Ren has known me since 1997. She is not a stupid woman, and she is not a soft one. Everybody let it go. Everybody had a reasonable explanation. That is how you take a man apart in this country, not with anything dramatic, with 11 separate reasonable explanations, handed to 11 different people, who never once compare notes. My son sent me a birthday card that year, paper, in the post, to the house. I never saw it. I found out about it 2 years later when he mentioned it in passing, and I said I'd never gotten it, and he went completely quiet on the other end of the phone. He'd signed it Times Thinking About You, and he'd put a photograph inside of the two of us on the fabrication floor when he was 9, wearing my hard hat. Toby was 29 then. She was in that house 4 days a week. She had a key to the medicine cabinet. And she refilled the organizer on the Saturdays her mother was out in Strongsville. I'm going to come back to that. Let me stop for 1 second, because we're coming up on the part of this I have never said out loud in one piece, including to my own son. If you're still here, do me one favor. Subscribe. Not later now, while you're thinking about it. I put one of these up every single day, and the next one is already written. And in the comments, tell me something, and I want the honest answer, and not the easy one. That woman did the wheelchair transfer 4 times a day for 3 years. She hurt her own back doing it. She sat in a parking garage for 2 hours at a stretch more times than anybody counted. Do you believe a person can do all of that, and be doing the other thing at the same time? Because I lived it. And I still cannot make those 2 women be the same woman. Tell me what you think. I read every single one. After Petra said what she said, I did nothing for 4 days. That is not courage, and I'm not going to pretend it was strategy. I was 56 years old. I couldn't walk. I couldn't use a telephone without help. And a woman I'd known for 18 years had just suggested something to me that, if it were true, meant my wife was killing me, and if it were false, meant I was a paranoid sick man who'd let his cook turn him against the woman who carried him to the bathroom. Both of those doors are horrifying. I want you to actually sit in that for a second, because everybody skips past it. Whichever way that turned out, something in my life was ending that week. What I did in those 4 days was test her. Not cleverly. On the Wednesday evening, I asked Delia whether Dr. Banog had said anything at the last appointment about trying something different. And I watched her face while she answered. She said he had raised it. She said they'd discussed it. She said he didn't think a change was worth the risk, given how poorly I'd tolerated the last adjustment. She was completely relaxed. She was folding towels while she said it. There was nothing there. I looked, and there was nothing there at all. And that is exactly what decided me. Because a woman with nothing to hide and a woman who has been hiding something for 5 straight years look times identical times by year 5. There's no tell left. The tell burns off somewhere in the first 18 months, and after that you are simply watching a person live. I have thought about that more than almost anything else in this story. The tell burns off. Remember that. On the 5th day I said, do it. She said, do what? And I said, whatever it is you already decided to do. She said, all right. The next morning, Petra Osei was in that kitchen before my wife came down. She made a fresh cup, and she carried the other one to the sink. That was it. That was the entire operation. And it went on for 14 months, and it never once got more sophisticated than a woman standing in a kitchen at 20 minutes to 7. The first thing that came back wasn't strength. It was mornings. For 5 years I had spent from about 7 until 11 in a gray underwater place. Not sleepy exactly, submerged. I described it to 4 different doctors, and none of them had a use for it, because it didn't fit the disease. So after a while I stopped mentioning it. About 3 weeks in, I realized I'd been awake since 6:30 and had followed an entire hour-long program on the radio. And I sat there and thought, that's the weather. That's a good stretch. That's the physical therapy I restarted. I gave the credit to everything except the one thing. 5 weeks in, I picked up a mug with one hand and drank out of it. I was alone in the front room. I set that mug back down and put both palms flat on the arms of that chair and just sat there, because if this was working, then it was true. You do not want it to be true. I need people to understand that, because everybody hears a story like this and assumes I was relieved. I was not relieved. I sat in that room and understood that I was now going to have to go back through 5 years and reread every single day of it. Every kindness, every drive, every night she sat on the floor next to my chair and rubbed my feet because they'd gone cold. All of it, again, with the new information. That is not a rescue. That is a second illness, and it arrives the same week the first one starts lifting. 10 weeks in, I stood up. Not well. I got about 4 feet from the chair holding onto the back of a sofa, and my legs were shaking so badly that Petra took my elbow, and we went straight back down. She was crying. I was not. I have thought about that a great deal too. She sat down on the floor next to that sofa with her back against it, and said something in Twi that I did not catch and did not ask about. And the two of us stayed there, on the floor of my own front room, for about 10 minutes without saying anything in either language. If you have ever been saved by somebody who had no reason to save you and everything to lose by trying, you already know there's no word for what's owed. There isn't one. I've looked. Then I got back into that chair and worked out that I had two problems. The first was that if I said anything now to a doctor, to a lawyer, to my own son Delia would know inside of a day. She had the power of attorney. She spoke to Banag's office directly. She had the mail, the phone, the money, and the calendar. And what would I have? A cook's suspicion, and a man who felt a bit better. The second problem was that I was getting stronger, and getting stronger was going to be visible. So I decided to be sick for 8 more months. That's the part people ask me about more than anything else, and the truthful answer is not heroic. Some of it was brutal, and some of it was frighteningly easy. The easy part was that I already knew exactly how to be that man. I'd been him for 5 years. I knew where my hands sat in my lap. I knew what my face did. I knew how many seconds it took me to answer a question, and I could hit that number every time without thinking about it. The hard part was the therapy, because you cannot rebuild a body from a wheelchair without moving, and I could not move anywhere anybody might see me. So it happened between 11 and 1, 4 days a week, in a bedroom on the 2nd floor of my own house. On the days Delia was at the plant, Petra stood in the doorway where she could see the driveway. 14 feet, bed to window, 14 feet and back. The first week I did it twice a day, and had to lie down afterward. Petra counted out loud, not for encouragement. She counted because in those first months I could not hold a number in my head for more than a few seconds. I'd lose my place and stop. 14 feet, and a woman counting in Twi behind me, because when she was concentrating hard, she stopped doing it in English. The second week I got to the window and put my hand on the frame and looked down into my own back garden, which I had not seen from above in 4 years. There was a swing set down there. It had been Toby's, and then it had been nobody's for 18 years, and my wife kept saying she'd have it taken out. By month 3, I was doing 40 minutes and going up and down the back stairs, holding both rails. And there's a specific problem nobody warns you about, which is your hands. Wheelchair hands go soft. Mine had gone soft in 3 years, and those stair rails took the skin off both palms inside the first 2 weeks. I could not let anybody see that. So I wore gloves in the house, and I said my hands were cold. And my wife bought me a second pair, cashmere. She left them on the table beside my chair with a note in her handwriting that said, "For the cold hands." I want to stop right there, because that is the worst thing in this entire story, and it isn't close. She noticed. She noticed her husband's hands were cold, in a house where she was the reason I could not hold a cup, and she went out and bought me better gloves and wrote me a note about it. I still have that note. I'm not going to explain why, because I can't. And I want to be honest with you about something that I know is not going to make me look good. There were mornings I put those gloves on and thought, she loves me. Whatever else is true in this house, that is also true. And then I'd go upstairs and walk 14 feet at a time and come back down and put myself in that chair. I wore them every day for 8 months. And every afternoon I got back in that chair, and every evening my wife came home and asked how my day had been, and I told her it had been a quiet one. There were nights I nearly told her, not out of weakness, out of the sheer impossibility of the arrangement. She'd come in at 6, and set her bag down and kiss the top of my head and ask about the physio, and tell me something a foreman had said on the floor. And she was, I have no other word for it, she was lovely. And I would sit there and think, this cannot be what I think it is. I am a sick man who has been talked into something monstrous, and tomorrow I am going to apologize to this woman inside my own head and never tell her why. Then in the morning she'd bring the cup in and set it on the table by my right hand, exactly where it had gone every day for 6 years, and go up to get dressed. And Petra would pick it up and carry it out. Dolores Kinsella spent 26 years with the Cleveland Division of Police, most of it in financial crimes. She works privately now, out of a second-floor office above a shoe repair shop in Ohio City. I got to her with a note. I could write by then. Badly. It took me 5 days to produce 9 words I was satisfied with, in a notebook Petra kept in her bag, and she carried it out of my house in a grocery sack and mailed it from a box on Larchmere. 4 of those words were, "I think I am being poisoned." The other 5 were the name of the investigator my attorney had recommended 9 years earlier for something entirely unrelated, a name I dredged up out of the dark at 2 o'clock one morning and then held on to for 11 days, until I could get a pen in my hand. Kinsella called Petra's phone 9 days after it was mailed. She told me later what she thought when she read it. She said she gets 4 or 5 like that a year, and that most of them come from people who are genuinely unwell. She said the reason she made the call on mine was the handwriting. She said the letters were formed carefully and badly. She said a man who is delusional writes fast. Petra held the phone to my ear in a bedroom with the door shut, and I talked to that woman for 6 minutes. And at the end of it she said, "Mr. Sedlak, I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing I have ever asked anybody. I'm going to ask you to change absolutely nothing." I told her I'd already worked that out. She said, "Good." And then she said, "Do not go to the police yet. Do you understand me? If you go now, they take a statement from a disabled man about his wife, with no evidence, and she gets interviewed inside 72 hours. And then everything is gone." Here is what Dolores Kinsella built over the next 7 months. And almost none of it came from inside my house. She started with the pharmacy. Every prescription filled in this country leaves a record, not just what was dispensed, but the date, the location, the day supply, and the gap between refills. She pulled 6 years of my fill history through my own records, which I was entitled to and could authorize. There was a pattern in it, and the pattern was the entire case. For years, that maintenance medication was filled on a rhythm that matched a person taking it as directed. Then, starting about 7 years ago, the gaps began to open, a little at first, then significantly. Refills going out to 50 and 60 days on a 30-day supply, which meant that for years I had not been receiving what I'd been prescribed, not close to it. And there's a second record, because insurance pays for those medications, and every claim is dated, and it matched. Aurelio Banag had spent 5 years treating a man for a disease that wasn't responding to a treatment he wasn't getting. Then Kinsella did the thing that made it criminal instead of merely tragic. She got me tested. That took some doing. I couldn't go to my own clinic or to Banag, because Delia had access to all of it. So on a Thursday in July, with my wife in Pittsburgh overnight for a customer meeting, Petra Osei and Dolores Kinsella got me out of my own house and into a car and drove me to a private laboratory in Mentor, where a physician Kinsella knew took blood and urine under a chain of custody form. Getting me into that car took 26 minutes. Kinsella is not a small woman, and Petra knew that transfer better than most nurses, and it still took 26 minutes. All of it in a driveway in Shaker Heights, in daylight, in July. A neighbor walked a dog past. She waved. I waved back. I was inside that building for 50 minutes. And I want to tell you something that surprises people. I have never in my life been as frightened as I was in that parking lot. Not in the boardroom. Not at the trial. Not once. In a parking lot in Mentor, Ohio, with a bandage in the crook of my arm. Because in that parking lot I was still a man who could be put back. Afterward, sitting in the back of Kinsella's car, I worked out that I was going to have to hide that bandage for 4 days. So I wore long sleeves, in July, and I told my wife I was cold, and she turned the air conditioning down. She noticed I was cold, and she got up, and she went and turned it down, without being asked. The results came back 11 days later. The medication that should have been in my blood at a therapeutic level was present at a trace consistent with a man receiving a fraction of a prescribed dose. And there was a second finding. A sedating compound. Nothing prescribed. Nothing I had ever knowingly taken in my life. Present at a level that a forensic toxicologist later described to a jury in one sentence as inconsistent with any accidental exposure. That is the whole of what I'm going to say about what was in it. The specifics are in a court file in Cuyahoga County, and they can stay there. What matters is what it did. It took a man who was already ill and made him look like a man who was declining in a way that satisfied every single physician who ever laid eyes on him. Then Kinsella went and got the money. That's what a financial crimes person does, and it's exactly why I was lucky to get one instead of a general investigator. Over 4.5 years acting under that power of attorney, my wife had done the following. She had moved $2.6 million out of accounts in my name into an entity called Cuyahoga Point Ventures, a Delaware company, formed 17 months after I signed that document, of which she was the sole member. She had put Toby on the payroll of Sedlak Architectural Glass as a brand consultant at $155,000 a year. Toby has a community college certificate in audio engineering. There is no work product of any kind associated with that engagement across 3.5 years. She had taken a $240,000 distribution in a year the company did not declare one. She had refinanced a lake property in Cuyahoga County that I owned outright and taken the proceeds. She had changed the beneficiary designation on a life insurance policy in 2022, not to herself, which would have been noticed, but to a trust she'd established with Toby as beneficiary. And she had, 4 months before Petra Ose ever said a word in that kitchen, retained a firm in Chicago to explore a sale of the company. Kinsella's report on the money runs 73 pages. I read all of it in one sitting at a desk above a shoe repair shop with her sitting across from me, not saying anything. And that last item is what turns this from theft into a clock, because the company sits inside my father's trust, and as long as it is a Times company, it is principal, and principal goes to blood. But sell the company for cash, and that trust is suddenly holding a pile of money that gets managed and invested and moved and feed by a trustee who by then was taking his direction from my attorney. In fact, she was never going to inherit it. She had understood that since the autumn of 2010, so she was going to liquidate it while I was still alive, and still hers. Kinsella put it in one line at the bottom of page 70, and I have that page in a drawer in my kitchen. Subject's interest lies in the continued incapacity of the principal, not in his death. That's why she never finished it. That's the answer to the question everybody asks me, which is, why 5 years? Why not just get it over with? Because dead, I was worth a monthly check to her. Alive, and in that chair, I was worth all of it. Ruth Ann Peltzar has been on that board for 24 years and chaired it for 11. My father put her there. She had been fighting the sale for 2 solid years. She couldn't stop it. She had 2 other directors with her, and the rest were tired, and the math was the math. The trust holds the majority, and the majority was being voted by my wife on my behalf. And my wife wanted the sale. Petra found out about the number before I did. She was wiping down a sideboard in the dining room in July while Delia was on a call in the next room, and she heard the word Chicago, and she heard a figure. And she wrote that figure on the back of a receipt in her apron pocket and handed it to me that afternoon. $285 million. She had that number 3 weeks before the board packet went out. A woman with a cloth in her hand had better intelligence on my own company than I did. The special meeting was set for a Tuesday morning in October, in the boardroom on the 3rd floor of the Flats facility, the one with the windows over the river. Purpose: approval of an asset purchase agreement with a private investment firm out of Chicago called Harlan Vesey Partners. $285 million for the operating assets. 362 employees. And a phrase in the deck about consolidation of fabrication operations, which is the phrase you use when you mean the Cleveland plant closes in year 2. Kinsella and I had the file by then. All of it. Pharmacy records, toxicology, chain of custody, bank tracing. 5 years of medical charts documenting a decline that had a cause nobody had ever gone looking for. The county prosecutor's office took 9 weeks with it. That is fast for a case like that. Kinsella walked it in herself, to a prosecutor she'd worked with back when the woman was 3 years out of law school. The warrant was signed on a Friday. They were going to arrest her at the house Saturday morning. I asked them to wait until Tuesday. Kinsella told me it was a bad idea. She said the single worst outcome in a case like this is a defendant who gets 3 extra days and a bad feeling. She said people run. She said people do worse than run. I told her Delia wasn't going to run, because in 5 years she had never once done anything that looked like panic. I said that was the entire point of her. Kinsella said, "That's not a reason, Gus. That's a bet." She was right. I made it anyway. That was a favor, and it was not a small one, and the prosecutor did not like it. What made it possible was that the meeting was on a calendar, at a known location, with a known start time, and there is not much flight risk in a woman who is chairing a $285 million transaction that morning. And I asked for those 3 days for exactly one reason. 362 people worked in that building. Their jobs were on the table at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, And I was not going to let that vote happen and then spend 2 years trying to unwind it in a courtroom. There were 3 nights between the warrant and the meeting. Friday I did not sleep at all. Saturday I slept fine, which bothered me considerably more. Monday night my wife made dinner. She sat across from me and told me about the deck, and about a director she was worried about, and about how she thought Tuesday was going to be a long day but a good one. She cut my food up, because I couldn't. Il était. I've been asked whether that was cruel. I have decided it wasn't. I have also decided I'm not going to argue with anybody who thinks otherwise. There was a warrant with her name on it, in a courthouse 9 miles from where we were sitting, and she had brought me a cup of tea that morning, same as every other morning. She said, "You're quiet tonight." I said I was tired. She talked for a while about a director named Bickerstaff who'd been wobbling for a month, and about whether the Chicago people were going to move on the consolidation language. And then she said the thing that has stayed with me more than anything else she said in 22 years. She said, "When this closes, we're going somewhere flat. Somewhere I can push you along a boardwalk for a week, and we don't have to talk to a single person. And here is what I can't get around." She meant it. Whatever was happening inside that woman, she was sitting at my kitchen table on a Monday night in October, genuinely looking forward to pushing her husband's wheelchair along a boardwalk somewhere warm. Then she said, "Do you want to try to come tomorrow?" I said no. She said, "All right." And she reached over and put her hand on top of my hand on the table, the way she had 10,000 times. And she said, "We're nearly through the worst of it." I said, "I thought so too. And I want to tell you what I almost said instead, because I have never told anybody this part. I almost said her name, just her name, because for about 2 seconds, I wanted to give her the chance to run. I don't know what that says about me. I've stopped trying to work it out. Tuesday morning, Petra Ose dressed me in a suit I had not worn in 4 years. It was too big. There was nothing to be done about that. And there's a thing about that morning I've never told anybody either. I sat on the edge of the bed while Petra did the buttons at my cuffs, and I could not get my breath. Not from the disease, from the other thing. I sat there about 4 minutes with my hands on my knees, like a man at the end of a race, in a suit hanging off my shoulders, in a bedroom where I had walked 14 feet at a time for 8 months. And she did not tell me it was going to be all right. She said, "Mr. Sedlak, we are going to be late." Cass drove. I'd called my son on the Saturday from Kinsella's office the first time in 3 years he had heard my voice without his stepmother somewhere in the room. I told him almost nothing, only that I needed him at a certain address at a certain time, and that he must not come to the house. He asked one question. He asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "I'm going to be." He was in that car outside the Flats facility at 8:40 in the morning with both hands on the wheel, and he did not ask me one single thing on the drive. And when I got out of the passenger seat under my own power, stood up out of a car, in a parking lot, on my own legs, my son made a sound I am not going to try to write down. Then he tapped the roof of the car 3 times. He's done that since he was 4 years old when he's frightened, and he has never once known that he does it. The meeting started at 9. I know how the first 40 minutes went, because 7 different people have told me. Delia opened. The Harlan Vesey people presented for about 20 minutes. Ruthann Peltzar asked 3 questions in a row about the consolidation language and did not get an answer she liked. Bickerstaff cleaned his glasses twice. At 9:41, they moved to the vote. Cass walked me to that door and stopped. I said, "Wait here." He said, "No." I said, "Cass, wait here." And he said, "I've waited 3 years." And he opened the door for me. I came in at 9:42. The door at that end of the room is heavy and it makes a noise when it swings a low knock against the frame. 11 heads came up, and I walked the length of that table. It's 34 feet. I've measured it since. Now I want to slow all of this down, because I have relived it more times than is good for a person, and I remember it in a level of detail that I think tells you something about what your body does to you in a moment like that. I remember the room smelled like coffee and toner. I remember the windows behind the far end doing that thing October light does over the river, flat and silver, no glare, everything in the room slightly gray. I remember a legal pad in front of Ruthann Peltzar, with absolutely nothing written on it. I remember the man from Harlan Vesey at the far end still had a laser pointer in his hand, and he did not put it down. Not once. He held that thing the whole time like he'd forgotten his arm was attached to him. I remember a woman 2 seats down taking minutes, and her hands came off the keyboard and stayed in the air about 4 inches above it. And I remember that nobody stood up. That's the part nobody believes. There was no gasp. Nobody shouted. Nobody scraped a chair back. 11 people watched a man they had all been told for 3 years could not stand walk 34 feet down a conference table, and that room made no sound at all. And I'll tell you what was going through my head, and it wasn't triumph. I was thinking, do not fall. Whatever else happens in the next 4 minutes, do not fall, because if you go down in this room, they will remember the falling and nothing else. 14 feet at a time for 8 months. Bed to window. A woman counting behind me in a language I don't speak. I kept my hand off that table. I decided that in the car. I was not going to touch it for balance, and I didn't. And then I looked at my wife. She had her hand flat on a page of the deck, and she did not move it. Not to her face, not off the paper. It stayed exactly where it was, spread out on a page of a document she'd spent 2 years building. And her face did something I have never seen on a human being before or since, and do not have the vocabulary for. It wasn't fear. It was arithmetic. I watched a woman I had been married to for 22 years try to work out, in about 4 seconds, what she could still salvage. That's the image. Not the walking. That. And if you have ever watched somebody you love calculate instead of react, if you've ever caught the pause where the feeling was supposed to go, then you already know you don't recover from seeing it. I can forgive a great deal. I have forgiven a great deal. You cannot unsee arithmetic. I did not make a speech. People assume I did, and it irritates me more than it should. I handed the corporate secretary a notarized revocation of the power of attorney, executed 6 days earlier. And I said that as of that document, my wife had no authority to vote my shares or to act for me in any capacity whatsoever. I said I was voting my shares against the transaction, and I said the meeting could proceed however the chair wished. Then Ruthann Pelchar stood up. She is 73 years old. She has been on that board since I was 34, and she came up out of that chair like a woman who had been waiting 2 years to do it. She said, "The transaction fails." And then 2 detectives came through the same door I'd come through. One of them said my wife's full name, as a question. She said yes. They arrested her at that table, in front of the board, in front of Harlan Vesey Partners, in a room with the river out the window behind it, and 362 people working downstairs who did not know anything had happened until the second shift came on. One of the detectives read the charges out loud, which they are not required to do, and which I believe he did on purpose. There's a phrase in the Ohio statute about serious physical harm, and I watched 11 people at that table hear that phrase, and turn and look at me, standing at the head of a room in a suit that didn't fit me anymore. She did not resist, and she did not shout. She stood up and put her hands behind her back before anybody asked her to, which is a thing I have thought about a great deal since. And she looked at me the entire time. She said one thing on the way out. She said, "Gus, how long?" And I said, 14 months. That is the last thing I ever said to my wife outside of a room with a table bolted to the floor. I've been asked why I gave her that. Why a man would hand the woman who did that to him the one piece of information she actually wanted. Because she asked me a straight question, and it was the first straight question either of us had asked the other in 5 years. And I was not going to be the one who lied. I saw her once before the trial. Her attorney arranged it. My attorney told me not to go. I went. She was out on a bond her sister put a house up for. We met in a conference room in a law office in Lakewood with 2 attorneys present, and it lasted about 40 minutes, and roughly 35 of those minutes were her. She did not apologize. Not in that room, not at trial, not at sentencing, not since. What she did was explain. She told me she read the trust in the autumn of 2010. She told me exactly what she found, and she recited it accurately, because she had it memorized. Income for life. Nothing to leave behind. And Toby excluded entirely, because Toby wasn't blood. She said, "Do you know what that is? That's 20 years of your family, and then I'm a woman on an allowance, and my daughter gets a card at Christmas." She said her mother died in a rented duplex in Parma with a space heater in the hallway. She said, "Your father put a lawyer in the room the week I got married. Your mother had done the arithmetic on me before I ever did any on you." And then she said so out loud to her son, And you told me about it at a dinner party in 2006 because you thought it was funny. That's true. I did. I told that story at a dinner in 2006 because I thought it made my mother look small and made me look loyal. She said, they decided who I was in 1999, and I spent 11 years being better than that, and it changed absolutely nothing. And then she said the sentence the prosecutor eventually read aloud to a jury, because I wrote it down in the car afterward and handed it over. She said, I wasn't taking anything from you. I was making sure I wasn't left with nothing. Every factual claim in that speech was correct. She had read the trust properly. She had read the prenuptial agreement properly. Her mother did die in a rented duplex. My mother did say that sentence about her. And I did repeat it at a dinner party like it was an anecdote. I did not tell her about the will in that room. I sat there for 40 minutes and listened to a woman recite the arithmetic of her own life, accurately, and I did not say the one sentence that would have taken the floor out from under every word of it. Her attorney asked me at the end whether I wanted to respond. I said no. There was one document she never read, because she did not know it existed. The trial was 12 days. Felonious assault, theft, telecommunications fraud, 2 counts relating to the exploitation of a person with a disability. They considered attempted murder and did not charge it, and the prosecutor explained why, in a way, I found completely convincing. Attempted murder requires proving she intended me to die. Every piece of evidence in that file proved the exact opposite. She needed me alive. Charging it and losing it would have handed the defense a story about overreach, and that story would have infected everything else in the room. The defense was 2 things, and both of them were smart. The first was that I'd been non-compliant with my own medication, that a proud man with a degenerative disease had quietly stopped taking what he was told to take the way a genuinely large number of patients do, and that a devoted wife was being blamed for a decline she'd spent 5 years trying to slow. The second was that a sick, confused man had been turned against that wife by a household employee with a grievance and an investigator with an invoice. The first one very nearly worked. It's a real phenomenon, and that jury heard about it for an hour and a half from an expert who was not lying about a single thing he said. I sat there and listened to a version of myself I recognized. A proud man. A man who hated the rollator. A man who'd rather decline than be seen managing it. He wasn't wrong about that man. He was just wrong about that year. What killed it was the second finding in the toxicology. The one there was no innocent explanation for. Because a man can decline to take his own medicine. He cannot administer to himself, for 5 years, something he does not know he is taking. The state called 9 witnesses. The pharmacy records custodian. The forensic toxicologist. Dr. Banag. Kinsella for most of a day on the money. A bank compliance officer. Ruth Ann Peltzar, on what that sale would have done to the plant. And Petra Ose, who was on that stand for 2 hours and 50 minutes. She is 62 years old. She has an accent. She has cooked and cleaned in other people's houses for 36 years. And defense counsel went at her for most of an afternoon, and she did not move 1 inch. He asked whether she'd ever been disciplined in that house. She said no. He asked whether she'd ever asked Mrs. Sedlak for a raise and been refused. She said yes. In 2019, he asked whether she resented it. She said she had thought it was unfair, and she had kept working there for 6 more years. Then he asked her why. If she believed what she claimed to believe, she had never gone to the police. And Petra Ose said, because they would have believed her, and not me. He asked her what she meant by that. She said, Sir, I cook in people's houses. He moved on to something else. He had to. There was nowhere left for him to go with it, and everybody in that room knew it, including the jury. One of them told a reporter afterward that it was the moment the case ended. Delia did not testify. Her counsel would have had to be out of his mind to put her up, and everybody knew it. But she watched me testify. 2 hours on the Wednesday and another hour Thursday morning. She sat 11 feet away at the defense table and looked at me the entire time. And about halfway through that second hour I stopped being able to look anywhere except at the prosecutor, and I stayed that way for the rest of it. The jury was out 4 hours and 20 minutes. Guilty on all counts. I was in the room. Cass was next to me. Petra was 2 rows back with her son. And when the foreman read the first count, my son reached over and tapped the back of my hand 3 times. He still doesn't know he does it. I've never told him. At sentencing, The judge said something I have read the transcript of 11 times. She said that in 19 years on that bench, she had seen a great deal of violence, and that almost all of it took a few seconds. She said this had taken 5 years, and that it had required the defendant to get up every single morning and decide again. 28 years. She'll be 84. I did not read a victim impact statement. The prosecutor asked me twice, and I told her I had nothing to add that wasn't already in 12 days of testimony. Cass wrote 2 pages. He read it himself, standing up, and I'm not going to repeat any of it here, because it belongs to him. Her sister lost the house she'd put up for that bond, because Delia missed a pretrial date, and there was a forfeiture proceeding that got partly resolved and partly did not. That woman had nothing to do with any of this. She manages a dental office in Parma, and she put her house up because her sister asked her to. I paid it, quietly, through a lawyer. She does not know it was me. And if anybody watching this is inclined to think that makes me a good man, it cost me nothing I will ever feel, and it cost her everything she had. They charged Toby. I asked them not to. It wasn't my decision, and the prosecutor was right, and I was wrong, and I have come around to that. She took a plea, complicity, and theft. 2 years suspended, 5 years probation, and restitution on a salary she never worked for, at a rate she'll still be paying in her 50s. She was 24 when it started. There's a photograph of Toby Vaughn at 11 years old on the fabrication floor, wearing my hard hat which came down over her ears, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. I was holding the camera. She refilled that organizer on Saturdays, and she sent an email to a security supervisor at my plant asking that my son's badge be pulled from the access list. 29 years old, writing an email that kept a man's child away from him. Both of those things are true, and I have stopped trying to make them fit. Cass went to the plea hearing. I didn't know he was going, and he didn't tell me until afterward. He said he wanted to see her face. He said they'd shared a bathroom for 8 summers. I asked him what it was like, and he said, "She looked at me the whole time and I didn't look back." And then he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. And we haven't. I have not spoken to Toby since a Tuesday morning in October, and I'm not going to. She was 4 years old when I met her mother. I taught her to ride a bike in the alley behind that house. I sat in an emergency room with her when she was 10 and broke her wrist, while her mother was in Toledo. I put her in my will for a full quarter share when she was 17 and told nobody, including her. And she refilled that organizer on Saturdays. Petra Ose does not cook in my house anymore. She did not want to stop, and it took me 4 months to get her to. I bought the house she'd been renting on Ardenwood for 21 years and put it in her name outright. No mortgage, no strings, no clever structure. Her own attorney handled the whole thing. It's hers, and it goes to her children. And there's a fund that pays her what she was making, plus the raise she asked for in 2019 and didn't get, backdated to 2019, for the rest of her life. She fought me on every part of it, not politely either. She sat at my kitchen table and told me she had not done it for that. I said I knew she hadn't. And she said, "Then why are you doing it?" And I said, "Because I can." And she said, "That is not a reason." She took it in the end because her son told her to. Her granddaughter started at Cleveland State this fall, and there's an account for that. And Petra didn't know the account existed until the girl was already admitted, which was deliberate on my part, and which she has not entirely forgiven. Her son drove me to a physical therapy appointment once, in the 2nd month before I could drive myself. He's 41 and he does something with commercial refrigeration. He did not say one word for 11 minutes. Then at a light on Shaw Green Boulevard, he said, "My mother could have lost everything." I said, "I know it." He said, "I told her not to." I said, "I know that too." He looked straight ahead and he said, "She did it anyway." That was the entire conversation. He has never brought it up again. And I think about it more than almost anything anybody has said to me about any of this. None of it is enough. I know it isn't enough. There isn't an amount. A woman with no power and everything to lose looked at a man in a chair and decided to do something that could have cost her a job, a reference, and possibly a great deal worse. And she did it on a Wednesday in March, with a cloth in her hand. I went to see Delia once after sentencing, a facility about an hour out. I drove myself, which I mention only because 18 months earlier, I could not hold a cup. She'd lost weight. She looked at my hands first, which people do now, and then at my face. She asked how I was. I said I was walking about 4 miles a day. She said, "Good." And she meant it. That's the thing about her that has never resolved for me, and I don't think ever will. She meant it. She asked about Toby. That was the first thing she asked after the small talk, and it was the only thing she asked in 4 minutes that wasn't about herself. I told her Toby had taken a plea. She already knew. She said she was 24. I said she was 29 when she wrote the email about the badge. Delia looked at the table for a while, and then I told her about the will. I said that in 2012 I'd amended it, and that it divided everything I personally owned outside that trust into 4 equal parts: her, Toby, Cass, and a foundation in my mother's name. I said I'd put Toby in for a full quarter when she was 17 years old, and never told anybody, because it hadn't seemed like the kind of thing a man announces. I said the number, because she was going to ask, and I didn't want to say it twice. She didn't react to the number. People think they would. They don't. Numbers that size stop being money and start being weather. She said one thing. She said, "You could have just told me." And I said, "You could have just asked." Then I got up and put my chair back under the table and I left. That's the entire conversation. It took under 4 minutes, and I have never been back. She called Toby that night. That's how my stepdaughter found out from her mother, on a prison phone, with a recording announcing the call every 60 seconds. Nobody who might have told her kindly was still speaking to her. Cass came all the way back. He lives 11 minutes from me now, and he's at that house 2 or 3 times a week, and there's a thing where he comes on Sunday mornings and we don't do anything in particular. He was angry for a long time, and not at me. He was angry at himself, for believing it, for the 3 years of accepting that today was a bad day, for being 23 years old, and letting a phone call from his stepmother be enough. I told him the truth, which is that he was a young man being lied to by an expert, that the entire medical profession of this city was fooled for 5 years by the same woman, and that if a neurologist with 2 rounds of testing couldn't see it, a 23-year-old with a job and a girlfriend was never going to. That helps some, not all the way. It isn't the kind of thing that goes all the way. There's a Sunday in the 2nd month after all of it that I think about constantly. He came over and made eggs, and neither of us was any good at talking yet. And at some point he said, from the sink, without turning around, I should have driven over and banged on the door. And I said, "She wouldn't have let you in." And my son said, "I know, but then I'd have known." Here's what I've got after 2 years of turning it over. Everybody in my family said the same sentence about Delia in 1999, and I've thought very hard about whether they were right. They were not right. They said it because she was a woman from Parma parking cars in the rain. They said it in 1999, when she had not done one single thing. And if she had turned out to be exactly what she appeared to be for the first 12 years, sharp, decent, loyal, in it for me, not one of those people would ever have said a word to me about how wrong they'd been. They guessed. They guessed on the basis of where she came from, and they happened to hit. A guess that hits is still a guess. But here's the part that's mine, and it's the reason I'm telling you any of this. My mother said that sentence to me on a telephone in 1999, and I repeated it to my wife at a dinner table in 2006 as a funny story about a snobbish old woman, because I thought it made my mother look small and made me look loyal. I put it in her hands. She spent the next decade being told in 100 small ways that everybody in that house had already priced her. And then I handed her the actual sentence, the exact words. And she kept them for 19 years and gave them back to me in a conference room in Lakewood, with 2 attorneys taking notes. Now none of that makes what she did anything other than what she did. She had 100 exits. She could have asked me about that trust in 2010, and I'd have told her about the will inside of 60 seconds. She could have divorced me and taken the number in that agreement, which was a great deal of money by any standard that isn't ours. She chose the thing where she got everything, and kept me too. But I have stopped being able to tell this story as though it started the morning somebody first picked up a pill organizer. It started at a dinner party in 2006, with a man repeating his mother's cruelty and thinking it was a joke. So here's what this taught me, and the one thing I'd ask you to actually do about it. Be very careful about the sentences you carry out of your family and hand to somebody else. You will forget you said it by Thursday. They will keep it for 20 years. And here's the specific thing, tonight, and it costs you nothing. Think of one sharp little sentence somebody in your family said about your partner, or your friend, or your in-law, one of the ones you repeated once because it was funny. And decide right now that you are never repeating it again. Not to them. Not to anybody. Let it die with the person who said it. And here's the question I'd like you sitting with when the house goes quiet tonight. Who in your life right now is only reaching you through one other person? Because if the answer is anybody at all, then somebody has more power over what is happening to that person than any single human being should have. There's one more piece of this, and it's the part I have the least peace with. For 5 years, 362 people worked in a building my grandfather started with a borrowed truck, and their jobs were being steered toward a sale by a woman who was not entitled to steer anything. And not one person in that organization picked up a telephone and called the man whose name is on the sign. Not one. In 5 years. Ruth Ann Peltzar fought her at that board table for 2 years and never once drove 11 miles to Shaker Heights and knocked on my door. I asked her about it afterward. Gently, because I love that woman. She said, "August, we were told you couldn't follow a conversation. We were told it by your wife, who was there, and we had no reason on this earth to doubt her, and every one of us felt terrible about it and sent flowers." And then she said the thing I have been chewing on ever since. She said, "That's how it works. Nobody has to be corrupt. Somebody just has to be the only source of information. And then everybody around them stays decent. And being decent looks exactly like doing nothing. There's a thing I do now that I didn't do before, and I'm not going to pretend it's a policy or that I've thought it all the way through. I go out to the plant on a Tuesday, and I walk the fabrication floor, and I let people talk to me about their work for as long as they want to talk about it. Not a walkthrough. I mean, I stand there and let a man explain a lamination defect to me for 20 minutes while his supervisor waits. Because I was in that chair for 3 years and almost nobody talked to me. They talked over me and around me and about me, kindly, for 3 years. I would not wish that on anybody alive. I'm back at the head of that table 2 days a week. Ruth Ann still chairs the board. The flats facility is open and there are 391 people in it now. I still have the disease. It's not gone and it's not going anywhere. But treated properly, actually properly, it does exactly what the doctors always said it would do. Dr. Benag testified for the state. He was on that stand for 90 minutes explaining to a jury how a physician can write times poorly responsive to therapy times 14 times over 5 years and be wrong every single time. He's apologized to me twice. I've told him twice there's nothing there to apologize for. He doesn't accept it. I don't think he ever will. So before you go, I want to hear from you, and I mean it honestly. Comment a 1 if you think I was right to hold that arrest for 3 days so it would land at the vote that 362 jobs were worth the risk I took. Comment a 2 if you think that was reckless, that Kinsella was right, that it was a bet and not a reason, and that no company on earth is worth another night in that house. And comment a 3 if you think the thing I got most wrong was never telling my wife about that one conversation in 2010 might have ended all of this before it started. I honestly don't know which one I am. I've changed my mind twice just telling you this. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are right now. Somebody out there is hearing this at 3 in the morning with one lamp on, and I'd like to know you're there. Most of all, tell me if you've lived some version of this. If you've ever been quietly cut off from somebody you love by a person who was very kind about it. If you've ever been the one who was told times he's having a bad day times until the bad days ran to years, and you believed it, because the person telling you had no reason on earth to lie. You weren't stupid. A neurologist with 5 years of test results didn't catch it either. If you got something out of this one, subscribe before you go. That's the one that actually matters. I put a new story up every single day, and the next one is already written. Thank you for sitting with me all the way to the end of this one. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences. Fully rewritten and reimagined in Cleveland, Ohio to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.